So now that I have a national job working at UUA, I don't have to come up with a new sermon every time I come and preach. So I have been kind of doing the road show this last several months, in particular talking about bodily autonomy. And in many congregations, I have the opportunity to lead a time for all ages before this sermon. And I invite the children to come forward, and I start by asking them, well, what's one thing that your body has already done today? I swallowed my Lucky Charms this morning. I elbowed my brother when he tried to steal my blanket. I ran up and down the stairs 25 times. They always say really interesting things. And then I say, what's something that you love about your body? Something you're really proud of? I say, well, I love my arms because they hug my mama really, really tightly. Or I can do a handstand and a bridge and a backflip. And they just list these things. I love my hair. It's so beautiful, and I get to brush it every morning. It's fantastic because we haven't twisted out of them the love of their bodies, the in their bones knowledge that their bodies are miraculous. And then I come into sanctuaries with grown-ups who have lived longer periods of time in the world that we live in, and we have different answers. I led a retreat yesterday morning for the Association of Universalist Women of First Universalist Church in Minneapolis, and had them do a spectrum exercise where I asked people to move to one side or the other, thinking about messages they received about their own bodies. Were you taught your body is good and wonderful and to be celebrated and loved? Were you taught your body was to be controlled and protected? Were you taught that your sexuality was a gift or that it was sinful, something to be ashamed of? Were you taught that you were the boss of your own body and you got to interact with the people who you wanted to, when you wanted to, how you wanted to? What messages did you receive about your body growing up? Can be parents and relatives, sure, but also teachers, TV ads, the nurse at school, your doctor, the religion of your childhood. Did you learn that you were always the boss of your own body? Did you learn that you could dress and present it how you wanted? Did you learn how and whether you could physically interact with people in ways that felt comfortable and affirming to you? Did people tell you that no matter what your body could or couldn't do, no matter how it looked, no matter what it was capable of or the size or color or shape of it, that it was sacred and worthy of love? If that was your experience, blessings upon the people who raised you. The truth is that for most of us, we've gotten extraordinarily mixed messages throughout our lives about what our bodies are and how we should feel about them. Dominant American culture does not hold values of bodies as sacred. And we are all exposed to subtle and explicit messages declaring that bodies are largely objects to be exploited, controlled, subdued, and commodified. From the day we're born, we are taught what our bodies should look like, what they should be capable of doing, how they should relate to the bodies of others. We all received those messages, but the content of those messages, your relative freedom or constraint, is deeply grounded in the identities you also held, right? Gender, sex, race, ability, class. The three American pillars of capitalism, cis-heterosexism, and white supremacy all fundamentally reject the idea that each and every person's body should be sacred and free. These ideologies, they live in the helixes of our national DNA, and they shape every aspect of our relationship to our own bodies and to each other's throughout our lives. One way of telling the history of the United States is to talk about the ways that certain groups of people have worked to control the bodies of other groups of people. European colonizers forcibly displacing indigenous people onto reservations and into boarding schools. Slave owners kidnapping and exploiting the bodies of African people for profit. Men empowered by law to control the fertility and the sexuality of their wives and daughters. Eugenicists, medical professionals, many prominent folks of whom were Unitarians in our history. We need to grapple with that. Folks who experimented on and forcibly sterilized poor Black and Indigenous and disabled people, trying to purify the race. Legislators and law enforcement conspiring to criminalize everything from migration to sex to Blackness to poverty to abortion to mental illness, using power to segregate and impoverish and incarcerate entire communities of people. My friends, politics are theological, and theology is political. How we treat people, what we believe about human nature, is a reflection of our theological anthropology, which is just $1 million seminary term for what we believe about human nature, human bodies, and our relationship to the sacred. Now, I'm going to dive into some old-timey religion for a second here. I promise I will not leave you there long, but it's important to ground ourselves in it. So take a deep breath, gird your loins, here we go. From the time of first European contact on these indigenous lands, now known as North America, settler colonizers used their religious beliefs to justify the theft of land from Native people and to create a system of government infused with their own worldviews. In particular, European Calvinism and Puritanism had a theological anthropology of the inherent sinfulness of the body. Bodies need to be controlled and restrained and punished, especially bodies that were not white, male, straight, able, and wealthy. Now, for these folks, it has to do with what I would very clearly state as an erroneous interpretation of the Bible. The way they told the Genesis story, Adam and Eve have been given everything in the Garden of Eden. They're chilling with God, and one day, Eve gets an idea to go disobey the orders and goes and plucks an apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and all of a sudden becomes aware that she's naked. And she invites Adam to do the same, and all of a sudden they're both naked, and they're both ashamed. And then God sees them, and God is pissed, y'all. And God says, not only I'm kicking you out of the Garden of Eden, but your punishment for disobeying me, for knowledge, for taking on self-awareness and free will, your punishment is to be embodied people. Now you will sweat and toil in the fields. You will labor to bring new life into the world. You will age and you will die. Your punishment is having a human body. And not only will that be your punishment, but it will be passed on generation to generation to your children for time immemorial. Fast forward a few thousand years, and we have stories of Jesus, understood to be the Messiah who has come down to atone for that original sin. In order to do so, on behalf of us all, Jesus must be captured, tortured, crucified, and killed. The violence of the state purifying and sanctifying Jesus and all of the human race. Shake it out. It's gross. I hate it. Every time I do it, I'm like, ugh. Here's why it matters to remember that so many of our so-called founding fathers in this country believe that stuff, is that if you believe that having a body is a punishment, that everyone is born broken and defiled, if you take it for granted that God is willing to grant some people eternal life while others burn in hell for all eternity. If you believe that bodies are sinful and shameful and to be constrained and controlled, well then, you set up a government that is empowered to act like a punitive and vengeful God. You don't bat an eye at structuring a society that is stratified between those who have the right to determine what happens to their own bodies and those who need to be dominated and punished. You set things up in such a way that very few people have access to the power and resources and agency that are needed to control their own bodies, while everyone else are treated as disposable, undeserving, unworthy of love and care. Politics are theological. Theology is political. So in that context, you can understand why it was so very radical that our universalist Christian ancestors rejected that God who would pick between the saved and the damned. Instead, they proclaimed a God so extravagantly generous and fiercely protective that no one, no matter what, could be separated from God's embrace. They preached a divine whose will for their human children was abundance and pleasure and flourishing, not in some other world, but here in this life, in these bodies. And because of this profound truth, the Universalists believed that the only hells we need to concern ourselves with are the ones that we ourselves create here in this life on earth. Early American Christian Universalism was a radical departure from the predominant theologies of the 18th and 19th centuries. Our religious forebears were regularly, sometimes proudly, accused of heresy, seen as fringe lunatics. But you know what happened? Their argument was so compelling that eventually little u universalism, the belief, not the denomination, won out. You walk into any other mainstream Protestant church in this country on a Sunday morning, you're not going to hear fire and brimstone. You will hear about the extravagance and abundance of God's love, the importance of creating a world in which all of us can be free and thrive here. And those folks, just like us, are putting those beliefs into action, fighting to end white supremacy and white Christian nationalism, fighting to create bigger and better spaces for our LGBTQ kin, fighting to combat poverty and unjust immigration laws, fighting for all of the things that would mean that we have the ability to choose what happens to our own bodies. Of course, it's not just Christians. We have Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and atheists and Wiccans and indigenous practitioners who are all a part of a growing liberal and progressive multi-faith movement. All of us show up in the streets together when we're lucky, when we do the work. And yet, I don't have to tell you that the battles are still raging and that the left is not winning them right now. We are still fighting over whose values will shape the laws of our nation, and today's radical religious right still has an agenda of punishment and domination and control that is literally killing people. Whether it's passing state laws prohibiting trans folks from changing their gender markers or playing sports or accessing gender-affirming care, to the crop of abortion bans or, in your case, incredibly antiquated laws that have been on the books for more than a century. Abortion bans sweeping the nation, making it impossible for people to decide when and if they want to be pregnant. Or making it a crime for school teachers to talk openly about race or gender or sexuality in their classrooms. Power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small minority who are governing out of the belief that most people should not and are not equipped to make choices about their own bodies. In my paid work, as Reverend Jim said earlier, I have the privilege of serving as the organizing strategy director at our Unitarian Universalist Association. I lead the team there, the Side with Love team that holds all of the outward-facing justice work. And at its core, our work stems from that universalist declaration that all of us are worthy of love, and that our faith compels us to fight for a world in which all of us are, in fact, free and thriving. We've been out here organizing Unitarian Universalists through Side with Love for many years, part of movements of immigration justice, racial justice, climate justice, democracy. And you won't be surprised when I tell you that in this past year, we have had to deeply dig into our fights for LGBTQ gender and reproductive justice. Things that, unfortunately, a lot of liberal folks mistakenly took for granted as victories that we had achieved. But here we are, once again, well into the 21st century, and our radical theological anthropology, our universalist values, are once again heretical, countercultural, and deeply needed. We are far from alone in holding those core values. Our progressive religious siblings are right there beside us, as are our comrades in the LGBTQIA liberation movement and the reproductive justice movement, because all of us fundamentally declare that every person should have the power to make decisions about their own body, the kinds of kinship and family structures we want, the resources we need to be safe, supported, and free. So drawing on those organizing and theological traditions, Side with Love about a year ago launched Uplift Action, our newest campaign for bodily autonomy that encompasses LGBTQ gender and reproductive justice. The tagline of Uplift Action is simply, because every body is sacred. We are talking about bodily autonomy for queer and trans people, for women and femmes, for people with uteruses, bringing a racial justice and a disability justice lens to that work. And the work has exploded in this past year, for better and for worse. We are actively working with congregations that are fighting in their legislatures these oppressive state bills seeking to criminalize people who are seeking to receive gender affirming and abortion care, even criminalizing adults and care providers who are helping people access care. We have already trained 350 Unitarian Universalist congregations through our new Reproductive Justice Congregational Organizing series. There's a guide online. I encourage you to check it out. This past fall, thousands of volunteers, including many of you, participated as election defenders or postcard writers or door knockers, bringing our values into the public square through the elections and our UU the Vote campaign. I will also say that we are in deep conversation with a multi-faith coalition of partners who are working hard to ensure that all people, regardless of where they live, can access abortion and gender-affirming care, and that we have the safe networks of hospitality and the resources and logistical support to get people where they need to be, even when it's illegal. Here in Wisconsin, at the grassroots level, there are so many ways to show up, and I know you're already doing many of them. I know you're deeply engaged in justice-making work, and I would encourage you to really double down on fighting for reproductive, gender, and LGBTQ justice. You can get started with our resources at sidewithlove.org. You have a growing Wisconsin UU State Action Network, WUSAN, which is doing incredibly important work, bringing folks, especially in rural places, together to organize around our values for reproductive and gender justice. There are so many organizations here in Wisconsin that are doing the work of organizing and direct service and support, ranging from the Midwest Action Coalition and Women's Medical Fund, which are essentially there to help folks access abortion when they need it, to the amazing Black-led LGBTQ liberation organization, Diverse and Resilient, to leaders igniting transformation, a BIPOC youth-led org working to build power and shape the people of Milwaukee through the lens of young organizing. My friends, you gotta fundraise for them. Get on their mailing lists, and when they ask you to show up, show up. Recruit your friends, form a committee, get ready to move. Familiarize yourself with their organizing and do what you can to ensure that they can keep leading. Now, we all waited with bated breath earlier this spring, as I'm not sure you're aware, you had a pretty high stakes election here past few months. I was so heartened to see the organizing that went into ensuring that you elected a justice who will, in fact, fight for bodily autonomy. And the fact that all is not lost means that you will still have a big job ahead of you to continue to elect more and more progressive leaders who will propose legislation protecting bodily autonomy, and to show up at those legislatures pushing more and more, both for the repeal of the regressive stuff that's already on the books and the expansion of the places where your state is already protecting our people. I invite you to get involved if you are not already with You the Vote. We are already organizing around 2024. It turns out that the minute you finish a midterm election, you start working on the next one these days. Thousands of Unitarian Universalists in hundreds of congregations across the country are doing this work. And let me tell you, it's not just important, it's fun, it's life-giving, it's spirit-feeding in the midst of all of the things that do not feel that way in the world. It's how I get up in the morning, knowing that I get to go and do that work. I also want to tell you that at some point you may need to do more than just showing up to advocate. My days now look like having one-to-ones with folks in small cities across America who are part of our congregations and who can be trusted to host trans folks, people seeking abortions, as they move safely to access care farther and farther. Do you know that people in Mississippi are going to Illinois for abortions now? So fight like hell for your clinics, expand coverage, make sure that your medical professionals are safe and funded, and also be ready to open your sanctuary. Draw on the lessons of the sanctuary and asylum movements. Be ready to take risks. Be ready to help people access what they need in those intimate, personal ways and on the public scale to create a world in which that kind of care is not necessary. Friends, thank you for all of the things you are already doing, for all the things you will continue to show up to do. It is an honor to be in the work with you all. May we all continue to be agents of change, affirming and supporting each other, working towards a world in which all of us are free and all of our bodies are treated with the sacredness that is so deeply inherent within them. I end with this little blessing from Enfleshed, which is a beautiful online ministry that celebrates the holy messiness of being people with bodies. They write, "Like clay in the hands of a potter, divinity shapes our lives and brings us into being. Each of us, expressions of divine intention. Sacred art, glorious wonders. We are of beauty. We are from love. We come home in justice. May we have faith in these holy capacities, letting them lead us to all we must face, all that can be transformed, all that we hope to become. May it be so. Blessed be, Ashe, and Amen."